Thank you, Dan. It's so amazing to be here this morning, and just thank you for inviting me here. I'm good friends of Meg, who I'm sure you'll know and love, and so thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited just to share this morning something that is, as you probably understood from the intro there, something that's very close to my heart, something that's very near and dear to my heart, and that is really God's heart for justice and his heart to see the enslaved free. And I kind of want to talk a little bit this morning around the concept of justice, and then we'll kind of go into a little bit more of the specifics of what that looks like working with survivors of the commercial sex industry, and then share a little bit about what we're doing as well. So just a little bit about me before that. Excuse the funny accent. I grew up in a little island called England. I came to the States in 2010. I was involved with missions work for about 5 years between Hawaii and the Philippines and Thailand and a few other countries in there. And then in 2014, I actually moved to California with the intention of being here only 6 months. But where are we today? 2020, nearly in 2021, and I'm still here. Met my husband there. We have a 10-year-old, 18, 16, I don't know. You lose count. The first year you're very methodical. Then after that, she's a year and some months. And we have one on the way as well. And as you heard, part of while I was here, I started outreach through a local church that then expanded because we saw the need and the reality of what was happening in the commercial sex industry here. So that's expanded to become a nonprofit, which includes some various initiatives that I'll talk about. So let's kind of dive in this morning with the thought of justice. What is justice? What does it mean for us as believers to live lives that represent God's heart for justice? Well, really, the word, it has many different definitions. It can be fair, to be reasonable, moral rightness it can talk about, even the administration of the law when we think of justice in the court system and maintaining what is right in society. There's many different ways to look at it. And the Bible, in the New Testament, we see this Greek word, and I'm not a scholar here, so excuse the pronunciation, but I think you say it, dikioshini, is the word that's used in the Greek. And that word can be translated both as just and also as righteousness. And I've always found that interesting because when I think of our lives as believers, I think the concept of living rightly and being righteous is something that we all know that we're called to do. But actually, those kind of words, righteousness and justice, are really interchangeable. And as someone who leads a justice movement, I often get people who sort of look at me and say, oh, that's great work that you're doing. It seems like it's something on the side of we have our faith and then there's works of justice. But really, I believe that it's a core part of who we are as believers to live lives that represent and fight for justice. And I believe that because I really believe it's at the core of who God is. In Psalm 68:4, God is introduced as a father to the fatherless, a defender of the widows. Deuteronomy 10:17-18, we say, the Lord your God is a God of gods, Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome. He is partial and takes no bribes. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and he loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. And again in Deuteronomy 32:4, the rock, his work is perfect, all of his ways are just, a God of faithfulness and without injustice, righteous and upright is he. So God is righteous and God is just. His righteousness is a natural expression of his holiness. And if he's infinitely pure and infinitely holy, then he has to be opposed to all sin, which includes the sin that is demonstrated in the sin towards his creatures. His righteousness means that he fights justly for all. And we see this issue of injustice really addressed with, I believe, greater frequency than most other issues in the Old Testament. And the words that we see there are tzedakah and mishpat. Tzedakah is similar to the one I just explained. It kind of intertwines righteousness and justice. We sometimes see it translated righteousness, sometimes just. But mishpat, I want to focus on for a little bit because that occurs 421 times. And in its most basic meaning, it really means to treat people equally. So giving someone, for example, in the case of court, giving someone the same punishment, no matter what their race or their social status. It's giving equal punishment. But it means more than just the punishment of wrongdoing. It also means giving people their rights. In Deuteronomy 18, we see this word used when it's directing that the priests of the tabernacle are to be supported by a certain percent of people's income. And we read, "This shall be the priest's due from the people." And this due, this support, is called mishpat. So in the context of justice, what does this mean? Well, it means giving people what they're due, whether that's punishment, whether that's protection, or whether that's care. And we see this word used a lot when it's talking about taking up the care and the cause of the orphans, the widows, the immigrants, the poor. In biblical context, those were the people that were termed the quartet of the vulnerable. And they were really the people that were vulnerable if there was famine, if there was an invasion or an unrest. They were the people that would be severely impacted by those things. And so this morning, I kind of want us to think about who are the quartet of the vulnerable? Who are those people around us today? And what are we doing to give them what they're due? What are we doing to protect them, to care for them when maybe no one else is? This would include refugees, migrant workers, the homeless, single parents, elderly, foster youth, those vulnerable to exploitation, those in human trafficking. The list goes on. But how are we doing? Well, 1 in 6 children in America live in poverty, with income and inequality having grown to the widest gap our nation has seen in 50 years. Of the nearly 12 million children living in poverty, 73% are children of color. More than 673,000 children were victims of abuse and neglect in 2018. There are 750,000 Americans who are homeless on any given night. 1 in 5 are considered chronically homeless. In 2018, 435,000 children were in foster care, and 41% were children under the age of 6. And it's estimated that internationally there are between 20 million and 40 million people in modern-day slavery. Assessing the scope of human trafficking is really difficult, which is why that number is so broad. The United Nations actually refers to it as the hidden figure of the crimes. That's the figure that they give, but it's so hidden, it's so hard to find it accurately. So the justness of our society is evaluated by how we're treating all of those groups and the many more that I could have listed. And to neglect their needs is not just a violation of mercy, but it's also a violation of justice. We cannot afford to neglect the needs of the vulnerable. Jim Wallace, he was a political activist, and he said this, I love this quote, he said, "The God of the Bible is a God who puts the world to rights." So that's what the Bible calls us to do too. In the same way that we can't separate God from justice, it's just part of his nature, it's part of his character. We can't separate our faith from justice. And I want to just share a bit of my story there and start in Isaiah 58, because this verse just grips my heart. And basically, the people are coming into the temple and they're desperate for more of God. And they say, "Cry aloud, do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their transgressions, to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me daily. They delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that did righteousness and did not forsake the judgment of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments, and they delight to draw near to God. Why have we fasted, and you don't see it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you take no knowledge of it? Well, behold, in the day of your fast you seek your own pleasure, and you oppress all of your workers." So as I said, we see people coming into the temple, desperate for more of God, and kind of angry, and they're saying, "Why are you not showing up? We're fasting, we're worshiping, we're doing all of the righteous deeds. Hello, where are you?" They want more. But God's kind of response, he kind of seems a little angry and maybe a little sarcastic also, because he says, they delight to know my ways as if they were a nation that did righteousness. God's people are coming into the temple. They're seeking him day and night, but there's a flaw. There's a disconnect, and that's really a disconnect between the intent to worship, but then the function of what worship, how is worship played out in our lives? And the answer comes loud and clear. He says, behold, in the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasure, but you oppress your workers. What was happening was the people's religion became detached from the rest of their lives. Their worship and their fasting had no impact on how they conducted themselves. And so the fast that they were doing, the worship that they were giving, it was no way irrelevant, but God was pointing at something much deeper. And I think for us, and I know for me, we can often view kind of spirituality and coming in to this place of worship separate from our day-to-day lives. But if we do this, if we separate the sacred and the secular, right there in the middle just breeds hypocrisy. And this was a bit of my story. I grew up in a Christian family, a loving home. I knew who Jesus was in my heart. I experienced the power of his Holy Spirit. I saw him at work in the church. I had a love for who God was from a young age. But yet there were many things in my home life, in my school life, and even in church life that just didn't make sense to me. And the focus of church and the movement I was part of was often pretty inward, not in a negative way, but with the desire to see people healed and free and experience the Father heart of God. And I grew up in quite a rural town, so everyone was just sort of focused on what was going on. But I was aware that there was something much larger than that, and I would say I was probably just born with a justice meter, where something in me was not comfortable knowing the sufferings of those in nations all over the world and just being happy, oh little me, in my little church bubble. There was a frustration, there was a discontent, a disconnect, and really a disillusionment in my faith. When I was around the age of 15, 16, I was really seeking God, really frustrated, and honestly, I was at the point where I was like, I'm ready to step in and run after you. If what I read in this word, what I read in the Bible is true, then my life has to look radically different. And if it's not true, I don't want to waste my time on a Sunday. I don't want to waste my time doing devotions and trying to pursue this. If this isn't impacting our world and my life, what's the point? That's the point that I was at, and I was ready. I was saying, God, it's all or nothing. I wasn't quite ready to say nothing yet, though there was something in me that wanted to. And so I said, God, I'm going to just pursue you full-heartedly. I'm going to give you 6 months, and that was when I was 18. And I attended a Christian ministry school through Youth with a Mission. And I said, God, you have to show me who you are in this 6 months, else I'm done. And I went, and you go through 3 months of kind of learning and lectures, and it was great. It was great information, but again, on a heart level, there was nothing much that changed. And then after you go through that, you are launched into the mission field, and we went to the Philippines and Thailand on that first trip. And it was there that I saw with my eyes kids who had no food. I saw orphans who had recently lost their parents in a typhoon. I looked at them in the eyes. Squatter villages where to get from one home to the other, we would be stepping on stones with open sewage all around us. Many of the people living there not even having shoes or just flip-flops. We stayed in little huts that a family of 6 would fit in, and it was smaller than the size of my room. And in the middle of that place, in the middle of a place where you could see human suffering, I remember this one church, and it was in the middle of one of these villages. They had out-of-tune guitars, half a drum kit, a hole on the floor, sort of barricaded, but just a hole for a toilet. It was 90, 100, really hot, really humid, no ACs, the occasional fan that people would hover around. But there I saw people that knew Jesus and were full of life and were full of joy and were filled with faith. More faith than I had seen in the comforts of the developed world and conferences and various things that I had been to. They had faith, and it was as I got down in the dirt and as I looked into their eyes and as I served where I could, it was very different to what I thought, but just washing dishes and brushing the side of the streets and getting covered in dirt and covered in mosquito bites. It was there that something connected and something made sense. Because I stepped out of myself. I stepped outside of just the religious activities and I served. And I connected with God because I connected with the vulnerable that were around me. I experienced God's heart because I chose to position myself in a place and say, God, how do you see this situation? How do you see these people? Another example, about a year after that trip, we were going down to Olongapo, which is one of sort of the sex tourist destinations in the Philippines. And one of the areas that I knew about but I hadn't really experienced in my heart was the Father heart of God, and just knowing his presence and who he was for me and seeing me as a daughter. And those were things I had wrestled with. And I went down to this city, and there was nothing in me that wanted to go. It was a pure, obedient choice. And I can tell you, because I got on the bus, and I was pretty much weeping, but I had no idea why. But I was weeping the whole way down there. And I felt a discomfort. I felt scared. I felt anxious. I did not want to go. But I stepped off this bus, and I had the most tangible experience of God that I've ever had, where I felt his embrace all around me. And suddenly, it was like this sense of homecoming. My spirit was lifted. My heart was lifted. I felt his comfort. I felt his love. And I went from not wanting to go to saying, hey, can we hit the streets tonight? And we went out, and we went a few hours into another city called Angeles City. And there is one of the most horrific scenes I think I've ever seen in my life. But it's about a mile-long strip. I've done lots of ministry there since. And there's woman after woman after woman lined up. There's bars and there's clubs, and the extreme place. Some of them, in the bars, the women are wearing tags, literally numbered like slaves. The customers will come in, point a light, and choose who they want to take home that night, and they just go in submission to them. And it was there in that place that I experienced God's compassion, God's love. In the darkest place I've ever been was where I felt the most of his light. I saw him just come into this street, and it was like I was seeing the dark, but I was seeing God's redemptive plan for it at the same time. And I connected with him in that place. And all my life, I'd been longing to connect with God. I said there was something missing, there was something distant, and I tried all the things I knew how to do, and the conferences, and the worship, and the message. And that was what was going on in Isaiah 58 as well. And God longed to connect with those people. He longed to pour out the very blessings that they were asking for, that you're asking for, that I'm asking for. But his solution was a little different to what they thought it might be. In order for them to find God, they had to leave the temple and bring the sacred back into the world with them. How did they find God? By engaging in the suffering of those around them. Isaiah 58, again, 6-9, it says this: if you are choosing not to eat, at least have the wherewithal to share the bread you are choosing not to eat with those who have no bread at all. His answer to their questions wasn't to spend more time in the temple, wasn't to spend more time in worship, but it was to pray. And it wasn't to pray more, it was to do justice. And I just wonder, and this is a question I ask myself all the time, and I find myself wondering again today, are we just going through the motions? We want something more in our lives, and sometimes it feels like we know how to die to Christ, but we don't really know how to come alive again to him. And we find ourselves running from one thing to the next, trying to find him, trying to get a new fix, trying to do things all of the right way, but still feeling like something's missing. And none of those things are bad things. These beautiful meetings, I love this church. You have an amazing both property and just place here and people, everyone I've met so far. These is wonderful. These are all great things. But sometimes I really believe that Isaiah 58 scripture gives us a key to what makes us come alive at the heart of our faith. It's the call to act justly. It's the call to love mercy. And it's to let our worship be pleasing to God, both upwardly and also outwardly, wherever we are. And so I pray that today God would just really show you, and hopefully he is already as I've been speaking those things, what does that mean for you? For some, it may mean joining a movement. For some, it may mean engaging in the suffering of others, like I've been sharing about. That's what it meant for me. But for others, it means leading with righteousness, responding in the same way to the wealthy man and the homeless man on the street, having the same heart towards all, advocating for that person at work who you know is not being treated fairly, sharing what you have with someone in need, caring for someone who doesn't have a family in this holiday season, inviting someone into your home who you know may have a need. But whatever it means for you, I can tell you this. It's probably not going to be comfortable. It's probably going to be pretty inconvenient. And it's probably, in fact, it definitely at least needs to start with a willingness to open your eyes and to ask God, show me who are those in need around me. One of the things that we do at Freedom Calling is we bring education to the community, to schools, to churches, to businesses, and we talk about human trafficking, and we talk about what's going on in the commercial sex industry, because we found that many people still do not know that it exists. Or if they know, we can hear a figure between 20 and 40 million. That's crazy, but what does it look like in our community? And many of us have a mindset, and I was right here when I came to the States, of thinking it was something from a movie or something from overseas. My experience all started in the Philippines and Thailand. The scene there looks very different from what it looks like here. Does that mean the need is less? No, it's just different. The woman is still enslaved in the same way. Slavery is not a new concept. The buying and the selling of humans has happened throughout history. The whole Roman Empire was built on this concept of slavery. And during the transatlantic slave trade, there were 11 million slaves transported throughout the world. And it can be easy to think that that's where slavery stopped. And there's been attempts and there's been legislation, but I can tell you it did not end there. It just looks different today. Human sex trafficking is the fastest growing business of organized crime, the third largest criminal enterprise in the world. In America, each year, as many as 100,000 to 300,000 children are at risk of being trafficked. As you heard, California is home to 3 of the United States trafficking hotspots. Since 2007, there have been over 35,000 contacted cases, 10,000 proved cases, and those really, I can tell you, are the tip of the iceberg, because those are the ones who first are brave enough to ask for help and then fight for justice in the court system and win. Very tip of the iceberg stats there. In 2018, the National Human Trafficking Hotline received more calls from California than from any other state. More calls right here in our state. And my eyes were open to these realities in 2014. I came in just thinking it was something overseas, and then I realized it happens right here. And when I came myself, and I came for a leadership school at this local church every day in Central Coast, that's where I met Meg. And a group of us, we started an outreach to a local strip club. Honestly, I kind of just had itchy feet. I'd been doing that. We wanted to continue. We had the opportunity to do a ministry project. So we went to a local strip club, and we kind of went undercover, to be honest. We didn't really know what we were doing. We just gave God our yes. And we went in, we paid our ticket, we went and sat there, and we just started praying. And when women would come up to us, we just shared words of encouragement. If they wanted prayer, we offered it. And we'd go every couple of weeks, and after a while, the manager kind of caught on to what we were doing. He said, "You're not here for business, it doesn't seem like." And so he asked us to go into the back and speak to him in his office, and we did. And after a lot of conversations with him, he said, "Well, if you're going to come, please could you just go straight back into the changing room, and you can talk and minister to the women there." So we had this open door. We no longer had to pay. We just went in and we would sit for as long as we want. We'd take gifts, we'd take snacks, and we would just hear the hearts of these women that are working there. And I can tell you, not one of them was there by choice, or at least they didn't feel like they had a choice because of the situations and the options that they have. I like to say a choice is not a choice unless you have options. If someone says, here's your carrots, you don't have a choice of whether to eat those carrots. You have to eat them. There's no other. And I've walked the streets up in Oakland here, done many outreaches there also. And I've looked into the eyes of women who are working in prostitution, who many would drive by and say, well, you're just choosing to be there. You could leave if you want. There's a police station down the way. But I can tell you, I've seen the desperation, the fear, the hopelessness, and they're not there working freely on the streets. But victims of human trafficking aren't necessarily being held by chains and gunpoint these days. It does happen that way. But if that's all we look for, we miss the majority who are being held by coercion, force, and fraud. We miss the mother who's lured into the States with promise of a better job to send her kids to college. The better paying job never came. The bills started mounting, the attorney fees, the fees to the system, overpaying for rent, uniforms. And before long, there's no hope of sending that money home or getting home herself to her kids. Debt bondage is what's keeping that woman trapped. And the words are ringing in her head, no one will believe you. You're not even here legally. If your family know what you've done, they'll disown you anyway. We miss the straight A student at school. She's at school all day, but she climbs out the window at night, obeying the commands of her trafficker for fear of her family's lives. What are the words ringing in her head? If you don't do this, your sister will. We miss the single mother, desperate for a financial break. So when that wealthy businessman comes into the store, he sweeps her off her feet with promises. She leaves completely willingly with him. But before long, she finds herself working the streets with her child at home in her abuser's hands. What are the words in her head? Come home with your quota and your kid will be just fine. And we miss the 16-year-old walking the street with a smile on her face, dolled up in makeup, walking with a sense of pride, luring those customers in. But we miss the man who's standing at a distance, telling her, I love you, baby. Just do this a little longer for me, and we're going to be all right. We're going to have that life that you dreamed of. You just need to do this a few more times. Are we prepared to see, to hear, to stop? Are we prepared to really know what's going on in our world, in our country, in our state, in our local proximities? Because I'm not going to lie, it's hard. There's times I want to quit. There's times that I wish I did not know. But William Wilberforce said this famous quote. He said, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you didn't know. So I'm sorry, because this morning I just made you know some stuff. Whether you knew it or whether you didn't before, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but there really is injustice all around us. There's men, women, young children being used, abused, exploited right on our doorstep. And we, as a church, we have to do something about it. We received Jesus into our hearts. That wasn't just for us. It was for freedom, for mercy, for compassion for all. So that's why we exist. That's what we do, to see that freedom that we've received be shared with others. We believe everyone should have freedom. There should be freedom for all. We want to see hearts restored, lives redeemed. And over the last 4 years, we've kind of expanded. We started with outreach, and we've expanded, as you heard, to include prevention, to include education in schools, community groups, and more recently a house, a safe home, where women can come and go through a year-long program to receive restoration. And if you would like any more information on this, I'm going to be in the little fellowship hall that you have, and I have some information out there, or we can just chat further. But I just want to end by saying this. The work that we do, it really is a privilege. It really is a joy to be able to know that through our prevention efforts, We might be protecting that one teen that when they then hear that guy luring them, that guy saying, oh, well, do this, do that, that red flag can go off on their head, and they say, hey, I heard about that. I heard that that's how someone got trapped, and that was the first starting point. That's one of the things I'm most passionate about, letting the next generation know so they can be on guard, so that they can be protected. And then offering a safe place for those women who have been working the streets. That's all a privilege, but seriously, we can't do it alone. And as I said, this is the fastest growing industry of organized crime around our state. We're part of an amazing community, we're part of a human trafficking task force, but we need everyone. We need community members, business owners, government officials, community groups, churches, whoever you are this morning, you can do something to see a difference. And we can look at the facts, the 20 million, the 40 million, and be completely overwhelmed. Because really what we're doing is just a drop. My part is literally a drop in the ocean. Sometimes that's kind of a bummer, because I wish it could be more. But if everyone puts their drops in the ocean, if everyone stands up and does something, then I really believe we can see the tides change. We can make a stand and we can see a difference for the next generations. So I just would ask you just to pray and just ask God, what could I do? Whether it's in specific regard to this industry and to women who are being exploited, or as I said, whether it's that person you pass on the street every day, you can do something to make a difference in someone's life today. So thank you for allowing me just to share a part of my heart, part of my story, a part of what we're doing. I'd love to connect with you further. But for now, we're going to invite up Pastor Mark, I believe, and the amazing worship team to have our time of communion together.